Thank you, everyone. Um, Before we start the session, just a quick announcement. Tomorrow, between 9 and 11, there's going to be a panel and discussions on the Adolescent Collaborative and the program at the Packard office. If anybody's interested in attending it, please reach out to either Vishal or Neera directly so that they can extend the invitation to you. So this is a very exciting panel, not just because I work in sanitation, but in general. I think we're going to be talking about investments required in the sanitation space. We're not going to be asking it as a question. If investment is required, we know it is required. We will focus a bit more on the treatment side, but I just want to call out a few things in the beginning for the audience here. We were told really politely that the first session on sanitation went really well, but there were a few people who thought so much of the use of the word shit that my colleague Anurag had in the beginning was something unusual, and maybe potentially some people could get uncomfortable. So my response to anyone who's uncomfortable with the word shit, tough shit. This is too important a topic for us to be uncomfortable about. It is actually a topic that cuts across everything. Gender, class, geography, language, it doesn't matter. Each one of you know the consequences of bad sanitation, and if you do not want to actually talk about it, then I just think we're so far behind that we're not going to actually even get to the point of investments in the sector at all. So please get comfortable. I'm going to use the word quite a bit. And hopefully what we'll do here is get people to understand that sanitation has the value chain, but more importantly, it is something that affects each one of you in this room very, very personally. So to commit to working in the sector actually just means you're going to commit to working in all the other sectors. If you're doing adolescent girls program, your success partly will depend if there is sanitation services in some of the indicators like schools. If you're doing agriculture, same thing. Your interventions will be successful if you solve the sanitation component. So in my opinion, all of you should just invest in sanitation. But in general, that's what we're going to try to do. Please ask a lot of questions. So I'm going to start with Madhu from the Gates Foundation. In general, the foundation has been quite supportive of SHIT for a while now, for about 10 years, and I wanted to just get a sense from you, Madhu. Given that we've told everyone that the government funds a large Swatch Bharat mission program, and there are foundations like the Gates Foundation there, can you tell us a little bit about the size of the investment from the foundation compared to, say, what the government has? And why is it required that investment, at least for the sector and for treatment, still needs to be a top priority for us?
Yeah, so thank you, Krishnan, and again, thank you to Dasra for inviting us. And yes, the foundation sure cares about shit. We came to realize that very early. As you know, a large part of our funding is in health. And for the foundation, sanitation is the most upstream preventive measure you can have with the deepest impact on health, especially for the most vulnerable people that we care about, and among them, children under 5. As the panel in the morning talked about, they are at the most vulnerable. We lose more than 500,000 children every year because they have a lack of access to sanitation. So definitely, for us, this is a key priority area. Having said that, our investment is a drop in the ocean. What India needs now is probably an investment to the tune of $40 billion in sanitation for everyone, so that the country across the value chain is able to actually provide safe, sustainable sanitation to all its citizens. Under the Swachh Bharat mission, over the last 4 years, the government has spent already $2 billion. But you can still see there's a huge gap, a $38 billion economy, but it's also a huge opportunity. So the $40 billion is also a huge economy, sanitation economy, which provides livelihoods to a large number of people. Again, some of the most marginal communities in the world work in sanitation, especially in India. And as you heard also from my colleagues in the morning, the number of deaths that happen because sanitation workers are exposed to such risks when they do their jobs. So there's also a huge flourishing economy and a huge opportunity if we can get sanitation right. So I think there's a big gap. There's a huge investment that's needed, not only in infrastructure, but also in much softer skills, in training people how to do things, providing them personal equipment, engaging with households and communities to make them aware about what their responsibilities are towards safe sanitation, and that requires money and real strategic thought. Somebody in the morning session had talked about, are you focusing on behavior change communication? That's a large part of the work that the government is doing now, because this program is not just about building toilets, it's about actually having people use them, and for us it's taking them beyond that to understand what the responsibility is for communities and for governments to work together to ensure a safe environment, which means all of the waste has to be safely collected, treated, and then hopefully reused in the most best way possible. But that's a huge economic opportunity as well. If we can get everyone, there's opportunities for masons to build the toilets, for plumbers to actually service that, and then for transporters and treatment specialists. So there's a huge economy as well in that.
And Neera, just given that Dasra actually did work and get a couple of reports done on sanitation, from a perspective of a nonprofit like a Dasra that wants to sort of highlight sectors that were underfunded at that time, what efforts did you take to convince someone like a Rati that a report like this will have a long-term impact of then being able to get the sector to be thinking much more broader? Could you just talk a little bit about that sort of a journey and that process?
Yeah, sure. And I think some of the journey that we've taken with sanitation is similar to the journey that we've embarked upon with adolescent girls. As I see the pathways, it's starting to feel quite similar. I think it largely came from a place, I mean, what really motivates us at Dasra is when people say, oh, you can't raise funds for that, and oh, it's not going to work out. It's almost like that becomes this competition for ourselves to say, well, we're going to show you. And so I think we recognized that sanitation, and along with Rati actually, who also highlighted the importance, and together we said, let's just lay out the landscape, because a lot of times everyone doesn't understand what A, the issue is, B, all the great work that's actually happening on the ground, and potentially how could a giving circle or one's contribution actually be able to make that difference. And so when you hear $40 billion, you're like, oh my God, there's nothing that I can do. But I think that what we wanted to highlight was that A, what is the issue, and in the urban context. There has been a lot of research, a lot of landscaping, and frankly, a lot of money going towards rural development. And for us, it became there are urban issues, and being based in Mumbai and having sort of high net worth individuals there as in corporates, we wanted to then highlight how are we going to solve urban issues. And it seemed like urban sanitation in a very specific way was even more underfunded than, for example, rural sanitation. So it was almost a challenge for us. And I think through what we call squatting rights is the name of the research report. If you go and you look into the squatting rights report, you basically start to see what's the framework of urban sanitation and what models are out there. Because half of the time we're not sure how you navigate through all the organizations, right? Someone mentioned there's 3 million nonprofits. So part of what we tried to say is highlight these are the kinds of models out there, and also try and really say these are the potential for scale. For us, a big piece is we've got to invest in scale. The problem is just way too large in India. I'm not saying don't do things that are small and beautiful. Please do things that are small and beautiful, but please also let's sort of rally around working towards scale. So I think it was squatting rights which initially seeded our interest. The giving circle we were able to close fairly quickly, and then we actually invested in Shelter Associates, a very innovative organization in the city of Pune, very specifically, and really helped Pratima and her organization grow from providing urban sanitation at a household level. And so I think for us, it continues to be a journey. I think we've now put a stake in the ground and said, this is a field we want to be working towards over the next few years. And it's been a great partnership with Madhu and her team for us to really think about what's the next phase of our work.
Well, leading off from there for Madhu, in the morning we did hear people talk about how you don't always want to go towards sectors that are, everyone wants the sexy sector or the shiny sector. And general sanitation is not sexy at all. We're talking about a containment structure that's over 100 years old. But just as a caveat, if each of you do not have safe sanitation in your lives, you will not be sexy yourselves. So remember these things that I keep telling you. Given that it's a tough sector to get funded, and we're in the process of explaining how important it is, could I ask Madhu first to just say what are 3 priority areas within sanitation and within the treatment space maybe that would be something where you say if people had $100, at least 80% of it should go to these three right now because that's what's required for us to amass the scale.
Yeah, so, but I want to challenge. I think sanitation right now is the sexiest topic in India. So I'm super excited about what we're able to do because you can see the impact straight away. You can see that red on the shit flow diagram actually turning green the more treatment plants that we set up and actually have them operationalized. So it's super sexy for us. But in three major areas, and again, for more capacity build, for more long-term sustainable sanitation, I think capacity building. So the capacity building not only of people who are working, implementers, government, to understand the whole sanitation value chain, to appreciate where sanitation should be in the future, which is away from these centralized systems that are super resource intensive, what they can do, the focus on the small towns. And I'm really happy that Akash actually spoke about the burgeoning peri-urban area. That's the most neglected, and that's where populations are coming into. That's where the highest growth rate is, and also the small towns and cities. And that's where also the sanitation needs are the greatest. So hugely, a new amount of money that's required is in that capacity building, both with government institutions as well as institutions that can provide that technical support. The second is strategic communications, hugely important, as you know, because lapses happen very fast. We've had schemes before that focused on sanitation. This is the one scheme that's only focused on strategic communications. This is a Jan Andolan, as the Prime Minister calls it. It's a people's movement. It's not an infrastructure program. And therefore, a huge amount of money and research is needed to make sure that people's mindsets change towards not only their own personal use, but their responsibility towards sanitation. Because we know, even if you look around the US, it took a long time for people to understand that just throwing trash on the roads or using public facilities well, it's a journey. And we've just started that journey. So a huge amount of work needs to happen. And I think there can be very creative ideas that we can bring in from the private sector, from the corporate sector. How have you changed people's minds towards different issues? So that requires some amount of thinking and investment. And then overall institution building, because sanitation is going to evolve like every sector. And we need a large number of institutes who understand that can provide the long-term technical assistance. So that's what we think is super important. So these three things are very important. Building up curricula, using new technology, the use of ICT, leveraging that effectively both for monitoring the impact, and then building capacities both within the government and outside, and then building institutions and strategic communications. We can never underplay how important that is, which is engaging with communities at all levels, both through interpersonal communication, large-scale mass communications. What kind of messages work is super important.
Neera, would you agree that these sort of priorities you would see not just for the sanitation sector that you're looking at, but even cutting across, since we've talked the whole day across the themes of capacity building, is there something we're missing among the three here, or do you think these are the top three priorities for us as well?
Do I have to agree because she's boss lady? Or
No.
You don't have to.
No, obviously, I agree. I think a lot of what Madhu highlighted is a lot of what we work at Dasra towards enhancing. I think if I were to add a few areas that you were saying, you know, where do we really need to focus, and that might be a bit different or maybe the same for other sectors, is I think there's a need to collaborate. I know we say collaborate, but the challenge is how do you get collaboration amongst different stakeholders that have different motivations, different agendas, different language, different ways of behaving, and building that alignment, I think, is really key. So getting the government to the table, the private sector to the table, the nonprofits and implementing partners, the academic experts, the World Banks, who are we going to put into this tent to really achieve you know, the outcomes that we're looking for? I think to be able to facilitate that is really important. So even if it's $100 that's going towards this, I think having the mindset of asking and encouraging multi-stakeholder engagement, I feel is really important for this sector. I think the second thing is what I'm really excited about, and I think we need to think about in the sanitation space very specifically, is innovative financing. And I know like the buzzword is this social impact bonds and everyone's going up and down and jumping all around about it, and in some sense it's just regular grant making with milestones. I think there's a phenomenal opportunity for us to just rethink financing in the sanitation space where you can use philanthropy as a bit of the risk capital. But I think given the kind of money that's needed for all the way from infrastructure to behavior change, I think there's really innovative ways for us to think about different kinds of capital and therefore different kinds of players moving into this space. So I think beginning to think around innovative financing, I know the US has looked at municipal financing in such a great way specifically for this issue. Are there things in India that we need to be at the forefront of? And I think it requires us to really begin to engage government funding into the innovative structure. So that would be my second thing. You know, my third thing is very similar to what Madhu was saying around sort of strategic communications. And I think it's about telling the story around why this is important, but why this is important for everyone. And so changing a bit of the narrative, right? They did such a great job on secondhand smoke, right? Or now everyone's talking about pollution in Bombay. I didn't even know it was an issue till like last year. So how is this affecting everyday life for everyday people, not just, oh, it's those people in the slums that it happens to affect? I think that's going to require a special kind of campaigning, a communications, a kind of public health movement building. And I feel that changing some of that narrative is going to cost us money, innovation, and real creativity around that, I think is going to help us rally, you know, a stronger sense of engagement.
So actually taking off from the idea of the collaboration, the other question I was asking was also what are innovative investments we can have in the sector? And what is unique about both of you here is through the work we're doing with the Gates Foundation, we are pretty much pushing platforms which are collaborative platforms. We have various types of them Madhu can talk about, but the same thing we see a support and investment in a collaborative for adolescent girls. We feel it's important because it seems to have an impact, but if you could talk a little bit about how do you convince donors to not just be thinking about individual grants, but actually giving a grant to a platform and a collaborative, because the impact could be much higher.
Yeah, so I think as a foundation, we are very wedded to the idea of collaboration. We know, even though we are very generously funded and resourced, that we can't go it alone. Obviously, the impact will be only when we have lots of voices and lots of people around the table. So as the WASH team, at the foundation in India, we've done a couple of platforms. One that you talked about, Neera, which is to bring corporates and government and NGOs and nonprofits together, and that's called the India Sanitation Coalition. It's led by a very, very esteemed banker, ex-banker, Naina Lal Kidwai, who used to be ex-chairperson of the of HSBC. And she got into this because she was head of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce, led their water practice, and because of that was really motivated to now work on sanitation and is now a big believer. So is leading that. It's created a great platform to engage with all of the corporates who are investing in various development agendas and bring them on the sanitation platform. The second one that we built together with Dasra was called the National Fecal, Sludge and Septage Management Alliance. Hopefully we have a better name for it soon. But it became a really powerful platform, and it came together just because there were so many of us talking about this issue, and there weren't enough people who knew what this meant. And the power of that platform has been amazing even to us. So within 9 months of us forming this alliance, which was a group of organizations that felt that fecal sludge management was really the core issue that the government and all of us needed to go after. And in 9 months, this group was able to get a national policy from the government on fecal sludge and septage management policy. And this was the first time in the world that a government had actually got a declared policy with guidelines that state governments could follow. So that was really demonstrated to us the power of collaboration, not just bringing people together, but having one cohesive voice on one agenda. That's super important. Just as your collaboration, you have 4 shared goals and you're going to move policy in that way. And then that helps us take this to state governments. They've now come out with, 19 states have come out with their own state policies on the subject. There are operative guidelines that governments are putting together, and the Alliance is forcing that. So moving those kinds of platforms are very important, right? It's not just the Gates Foundation's agenda or Dasra's agenda or XYZ, it's a collaborative platform. This is everyone's agenda, this is everyone's opinion, this is their technical support, and we offer technical support to all the governments. So I think that's super important when you go after an issue like that. The third one that we are now thinking of actually graduating to is something called the Indian Fecal Sludge Association, which will bring in corporates and private sector. Because the one big thing that we are also seeing as a gap is that the private sector isn't completely on board. They're used to very traditional wastewater treatment plants, don't know much about the new technologies and the way that governments are thinking. So in this respect, actually the government has moved faster than the private sector has, and so we need to bring them along. And so we're thinking both globally as well as nationally how we can create a platform for the private sector to get engaged, see the opportunity, and move forward in this economy. So those are kind of the platforms.
Neera, could you talk a little bit about in terms of investing, you have Packard, you have a group of foundations funding this. Was it very hard for you to convince them to fund a platform along with directly the NGOs? Because with the NFSM Alliance, just for the audience here, it was a membership. All the partners you see here from who spoke in the morning are members of the Alliance, and each was asked to contribute how much ever they wanted to contribute. So that was an option there. It wasn't addicted. But for yours, was there a thought process right in the beginning that some of this money will go towards the platform?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a lot of different things going on in our minds with what we were trying to achieve with the 10 to 19 collaborative. I think one was definitely a platform, which we're calling a community of practice that some of you saw in that video. And that actually ended up becoming more of an interest from the foundations than the actual funding of organizations and helping them scale, because there's a real lack of having a collective voice of whether it's implementing partners or NGOs. But for the sector, what is that collective voice that can engage with the government, can engage with the private sector? And so foundations started to believe that this was actually an important piece of advocacy that was starting to come out within the Adolescence Collaborative. You know, to be very frank, the biggest challenge we have, and we do have, and foundations may not always know this, is their egos. So you get a Children Investment Fund, a Packard Foundation, a USAID, you know, all of these foundations together, and all of a sudden you're telling them you don't have decision rights, actually, and you're pooling money. And by the way, USAID, we're going to look at more than just health outcomes. We're going to look at these 4 outcomes, and you're going to have to be invested in these organizations implementing in a way that they want. It's not going to be a pilot, and you're not going to get to tell them what to do. So a lot of building that alignment actually happens one-on-one. And I think foundations underestimate the power dynamic. And sometimes as a facilitator, as Dasra, or even nonprofits, you need to understand that dynamic and help foundations use it when it can be helpful, and help them understand, please don't use that power right now. And I think what has been a real learning experience, and Madhu and her team have been phenomenal in even helping us understand, absolutely use USAID and Gates to get to the government, right? It's so great to have them there with us. But sometimes when we're sitting with a group of nonprofits, you know, we might say, it might be better if you're actually not here. And, you know, we'll promise to share what we're all talking about. So I think it is important for us to realize the power dynamic, and for us to be able to use it in the right context, I think has been something really important as you build these platforms, as you build sort of collaboration. And I think the other piece is there needs to be a facilitator. And maybe it's me touting about the importance of Dasra, and it doesn't have to be a Dasra kind of organization. It could even be an NGO. But to be able to support both financially and resources to the activity of collaboration is really important. It costs money to do these things. It's time and effort. And so although everybody has great intent and you're all aligned on the outcomes, you've got to be able to have the resources to drive that sort of collaboration. And that's where I think funding from foundations is really catalytic. For the $100 giver that you were saying, should they be funding a platform? I'm not sure. I think it's okay. You know, fund an organization, but let's hold organizations accountable to collaborate. Right? Ask the question, who else are you working with? You know, how are you collaborating? Use my money to help you to go to meetings. Use my money to foster some of that collaboration, I think would be equally catalytic if we did that.
Then the other question that has to come up, since we're looking at priority areas for investment, is given that a lot of the work we've been doing has not been looking at trying to drive more investment for traditional sewerage systems, what would be one or two things where you would say this is not necessarily an area where investment is required for one of two reasons? One, if it's old technology, we don't want to go that route, or it could be there's enough money going there anyway. What would be one or two things there that you would think for the audience here to understand that that's not an area where there's so much others that this may not be where you think there's a priority?
Definitely not for sewage systems. I will say that straight away. So if they're large funders and they think they need to set up centralized sewer systems, not really required. But I can think of more areas that people should fund. Okay. And that's really about, again, as I said, a lot more on the soft skills, engaging communities, strategic communications, that's super important. And institution building, I think, is what really is required now. Exactly to Neera's point, is they need unrestricted funding, they need to be able to grow their organizations, they're in the field, they know exactly what's needed. So how can we give those institutes the ability to hire teams? It's very difficult if you're an NGO trying to build a sector or impact a sector. If you don't know, I can keep these people for the next 2 years, right? Because you're being funded per project. So how can we build these institutes? Because that's how all countries have developed, right? And somehow we lost that story. And I know that kudos to Ford Foundation because of all the great institutes that they built. And I think our foundation has to do the same, and many other donors. And it's important to also pool your resources and say, okay, we'll get 10 and we're going to fund this institute to do these things. We need an urban sanitation institute, and we have reputed institutes. They just don't have the wherewithal to sustain these departments that are specialized. So can you create chairs? Can you create technical units within those for the long-term sustenance of the work that we do? So I think that's super important. And the second point that Neera said is that, as I said, as a foundation and other donors, we're seeing much more openness to collaboration. So I know you see a lot of ego, but I also see a lot of donors reaching out to each other, saying, both for collective voice, but also for reducing redundancy, right? We all don't want to go into one Maharashtra and all of us are trying to do the same thing, giving different messages, and not leveraging our resources well. So there's a lot of redundancy when they do it. So absolutely, you should ask the question, how are you collaborating? And who are you meeting? And have you learned from what's happened before? And are you taking the work forward? So I think all of those issues are important.
So it makes me a bit nervous when you're asking what to not fund, because I think everything ultimately costs money in some form or the other. So I was trying to think, I think where we've seen in our experience where you can be really challenged if you start to pay for community engagement in terms of sustainability. So when you're getting community workers and frontline workers, so that's a way that a lot of nonprofits scale, right? Is like Educate Girls gets volunteers from the community, others like Sneha will get volunteer health workers from their own communities. If you begin to pay them, and there's no ability to transition that worker's pay to a government pay or any pay, it is very difficult to keep that sustainable. So one part of engaging the community as a volunteer in the very beginning, don't pay for that. You're paying for it indirectly, right, by supporting the organization and the growth of that organization. But be very wary of the sustainability of that is probably one thing that kind of popped to my mind.
Okay, so then the one thing that we haven't touched, even though we talked about investments, is looking at having a gender lens when you look at investments in both the sector of sanitation, where gender representation is still weak. What is it that we should be looking at, or what we should be telling people who have specific interests? What about gender in both the sectors, and how should they look at investing in it? What should they do?
So yeah, gender integration is a huge part of the work that we want to do at the foundation across all our programs. Gender is front and central to what we do. In sanitation, gender plays a huge role, both for women most affected by the lack of sanitation, more because, you know, they have different needs, and that never gets taken care of in the infrastructure. So if you look at women's toilets in India, the disparity is huge. You will have maybe one little shed for women, and then a block of urinals for men. So just in the access piece, there's no equity. The second is not only their access, but their agency. So how can women become far more empowered to both take decisions, but also actually derive benefit from the sanitation economy? How can they become active players? We saw a powerful video of a woman entrepreneur in Andhra Pradesh, but we need many more such entrepreneurs, and making that safe, a safe space for them to engage with at all levels of decision making in councils. So the good thing is that now there's actually forced representation, right? So there's, in every council in the towns, you have to have a set percentage of women representation. And we're seeing that. In fact, in many of the cities that we work, coincidentally, the ones that are the greatest innovators and change makers are actually women leaders. In most all of the towns that we work with, the ones who've taken that leap of faith that we're going to innovate, we're going to introduce new technologies, are all women counselors or women principal secretaries who are actually ready to innovate and move forward. So the more we see of that, and the more we can force it on our partners to engage with women, both as leaders and as beneficiaries, make sure that their understanding is clear. One other thing that we're doing is trying to make sure that we have gender-based budgeting at town level and at state level, so that there is much more equity.
Neera?
So, I mean, I think there's no doubt we've come a long way, that everybody probably realizes the importance of investing in gender and women and girls. And I think what I wanted to leave the group with, which we often struggle with, is our own bias in the organizations even that we're funding. And can we push the gender lens when you're looking at nonprofits that you're funding, help them think about whether they really are using a gender lens? Like, do they have women on their board? Look at the leadership roles. Are there women leaders there? And start to help them understand the inherent bias with which they're functioning within their nonprofits. I think all of us need to take a bit more responsibility in helping each other kind of move towards including gender. And so I feel like a gender lens isn't enough. It's like we need to use the gender lens, but I think as funders, as philanthropists, we can actually help them move and be more accountable in kind of building this within the organization. So then I feel within the organizations, if you've used a gender lens and brought some sort of equality, then you're also legitimizing the fact that you're ultimately also focused on women and girls in the community. So I think we need to do actually both.
Okay, with that, what we're going to do is show a video. This actually tackles two things. One, it is a video that is creative. So we're talking about strategic communication. Some of the work we're trying to do is actually disseminate the knowledge and the information that the sector has, but in a very creative and different way. By that, we basically means at some point we think the time for reports will probably be done in terms of physical reports, much more towards videos, infographics, and in that, this was a video we got a lot of traction with very little effort on our own part. Once the video was out, it went viral. We'll let you watch it, then we'll open it up to Q&A.
ना?
हाँ भैया,
आलू भी काट देना।
हाँ भैया।
बाबा का टिफिन का है? पता है? आयुष अभी भी सो रहा है। पापा आवाज धीमे करिए। आयुष, 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 उठो।
मैं नहीं जाऊंगा।
क्यों? आज संडे नहीं है।
प्लीज पापा, आज नहीं, प्रॉमिस कल।
आयुष, जिद नहीं करते हैं। चलो उठो। कम ऑन, कम ऑन, कम ऑन, कम ऑन। यस। पहले क्यों नहीं बताया? ये तो होता रहता है। आयुष, कम ऑन, गेट अप, गेट अप, गेट अप, गेट अप, माय बॉय। यस, यस, यस। या।
कोई घबराने की बात नहीं है, सबको होता है। लेकिन आज ये दूध का भरा गिलास पूरा खत्म कर दो, कमजोरी आ जाती है बेटा। ठीक?
कमाल है, आज घर में एक भी पैड नहीं।
कोई बात नहीं बेटा, इसके लिए अगले महीने से अलग से मंगवा लेंगे। और प्रणव बेटा,
जी बाबूजी।
ला मेरे बच्चे के लिए पैड तो लिया।
जी बाबूजी।
कम ऑन, गुड बॉय। यस, यस।
बोलो सर, क्या दूं? अरे पैड का एक पैकेट देना, बेस्ट क्वालिटी का पैड देना। अपने हीरो का पहला दिन है आज, और अपना आयुष भी तो बेस्ट है ना।
यूजुअली सर, मार्केट में नया है।
अच्छा,
हाँ,
अच्छा दे दो, और चॉकलेट भी देना। कितना हुआ दोनों?
ये 8 के पैक का 50 और चॉकलेट को मिला के 60। हाँ, ये लीजिए।
बताओ, बायोडिग्रेडेबल है? सही है ना, हमारे टाइम में इतनी वैरायटी होती ही नहीं थी। ऊपर से सस्ता भी है। पापा को बोलेंगे कि यही लेके आएंगे, ठीक है?
ये रहा आपका चॉकलेट।
हाँ, ये लीजिए भैया। ओके, सो
थैंक यू।
ठीक है, चलो।
गुड मॉर्निंग बच्चों, गुड मॉर्निंग। कैसे हो? लंच अच्छे से फिनिश कर लेना।
भैया, पेट में दर्द है, थोड़ा आराम से चलाइएगा। ठीक है, थैंक यू। बाय।
गुड मॉर्निंग शर्मा जी, गुड मॉर्निंग।
गुड मॉर्निंग।
कैसे हैं आप?
बहुत बढ़िया।
आज आपको आने में इतनी देरी हो गई? भाई गाड़ी यहाँ पर कब से खड़ी हुई थी?
पीरियड हो गया उसको, आज उसका पहला दिन। स्कूल जाने के लिए तैयारी नहीं थी, फुल ड्रामा।
अरे अच्छा किया भेज दिया। आदत अगर पहले दिन बिगड़ जाए ना तो बाद में मुश्किल हो जाती है।
लेकिन ख्याल तो रखना पड़ता है।
जब आज पेनल्टी शूट आउट होगा ना तो तू स्ट्राइकर बनना।
आज मैं नहीं खेलूंगा।
अरे यार, तुम्हारी टीम का सबसे अच्छा बेस्ट स्ट्राइकर है यार, करना। अच्छा, क्या हुआ? अरे क्या हुआ यार, क्या हुआ?
गुड मॉर्निंग स्टूडेंट्स। Sit down. Thank you, sir. We'll start with roll calls. Roll number 1. Good. Roll number 2.
तू गोलकीपर बनना।
Roll number 3. Roll number 4.
किसके साथ होता है? मेरे साथ भी हुआ था। कब से?
Ayush and his friends. Stand up. क्या प्लानिंग हो रही है? Come on, share it with the class. Stand straight.
Sir, Ayush got his period.
Silence.
Sir, it's his first day.
That's okay. सबका first day होता है, मेरा भी था. Nothing to fuss about, okay? And how many of you already have had your first day? Raise your hands. Hands down. Ayush, sit down. And that is the place where you have to dispose this. Okay? See, this is a special disposable system जहाँ सिर्फ period waste gets collected. Good.
So that was an example of some of the stuff we're trying to do using different modes of disseminating information. It has a direct connect to both adolescent girls, but just as important, it is a connect to WASH, which is hygiene. Menstrual hygiene is a key component of it, and this also encompasses a lot of the work we're doing. But I will now keep it open to questions, but if there's any final thoughts from the two of you, again, the topic was investing in the sector in whatever ways is possible to drive the overall objective. If not, we'll open it up immediately to any questions.
Yeah, it's a question.
After we wipe it in our ears.
Wow, we were so clear that no one has questions.
Hi there. I'm interested to hear a little bit about the work in terms of infrastructure and education in rural areas and how that's different than the urban areas, if it is at all.
Sorry?
Rural versus
Just
urban.
in terms of WASH, in terms of sanitation, I'm interested to see if there's a really different investment that's being made in the rural areas versus the urban areas.
Okay. So in terms of infrastructure, in the rural areas, it's the real push, actually both in urban and rural, to get individual household toilets, along with a huge push on behavior change. In the urban areas, what we're also saying is you need to pay attention to treatment. In the rural areas, the problem is solved a little bit by the fact that you have these twin pit toilets, and they actually allow for decomposition of the waste because you don't allow any water in one pit. Once the pit is full, you change over to the second pit. Of course, there are areas that are land, where the water tables are fairly high, so those have to be built separately. But the economics of collecting waste from very far off villages doesn't work out for some of the solutions. So the twin pits are a really good solution in the rural areas. So that's what the government is really pushing under the Swatch Bharat mission, not only individual household toilets, but as well as paying attention to the containment system. In urban areas, we're saying lack of space, so you can't really build these large twin pit toilets. You need to have proper septic tanks. There has been less push in the urban on the containment part, but what we are now moving towards is both containment structures at individual household level as well as community toilets and public toilets. That's a big need and a big push under Swatch Bharat. And now the big push is also to create the treatment facilities, right? So if households are going to use toilets and are going to stop open defecation, you also have to stop open discharge. So that's kind of where the two infrastructure programs are happening.
It's one of the strange ironies in India where property next to a lake or river is incredibly cheap because it really smells. So this is a very real problem that urban and rural, everyone's going to be facing. So for us also to look at it, that's important to acknowledge. Anything else?
So this is a bit of a question from the last session, but Neera said I could ask it, so I'll bring it into this one as well. In the video in the last session, you talked about 4 outcomes that you used in measuring success for the adolescent girls program. How hard was it to come to consensus on that from different sectors, from the different players that were involved? And how do you see that sort of playing across in a topic like sanitation? How would you come to consensus on what are the outcomes we should be looking at? Because it seems to be like that would help a lot in the conversations we have around these different spaces, measurements, reporting. So just some thoughts on that.
So it was actually, we did some work with Bridgespan very specifically on helping us identify these outcomes, largely coming from a place of work that FSGs did around collective impact. And I think recognizing that if you had sort of the North Star and you had a set of outcomes that you said, if we achieved this for the sector, and you had that buy-in amongst stakeholders, like you're saying, then all of us can start to move along as a sector. So for us, being able to place those outcomes was really important. And the process of coming up with that, a lot of it was there's existing research that says these are, the most important outcomes. But the conversations and interviews we had with multiple stakeholders, there was general consensus that these are the most important. And also, strategically, they cover the range of sectors. So if you have a sector view, like I'm an education person, I'm a health person, or this is my, employment, skills building, money, all of these outcomes ultimately had different pathways to be able to get there. So you could achieve child marriage through an education, ending child marriage through an education program or a skills program. So I think educating folks on the fact that how you get to the outcomes is the next step, but first let's just agree on the outcomes. And I think it seemed to be easier for adolescents. We've actually been working with Madhu and the team to be able to say, can we place outcomes in sanitation as well? And if you look at, Bridgespan has a field building framework. So a lot of our work now is moving towards, you can fund a few NGOs, but what does it take in an aggregate way to move a field? And one of the core aspects of that is actually identifying outcomes, but there are a lot of other things that need to start to move into place as the field gets more sophisticated, whether it's data and evidence, whether there's academic institutions, whether the role of the private sector. And so I think all of us applying a bit of this field building framework, I think will help us, of which the outcomes are sort of sitting on the top. it was a difficult process in terms of the time and effort, but there was actually quite a lot of buy-in, at least for the adolescent girls piece. And Madhu should maybe speak to if it's quite obvious what some of the sanitation outcomes
Yeah,
are.
so I think, as I said before, and we talked in the morning, and I think my colleague Neera talked about it also. So the framework we had to work with under the Swatch Bharat mission was an open defecation-free India by 2019. And that was an outcome that the whole country really came around over time as one of the big missions. And using the same framework, we said, well, how can we take you beyond? You understand what open defecation free is, but we need to go beyond that, right? So we said open defecation free plus, which means you have to have open defecation free, but you also have to treat the waste. That's the plus part. And then you can have a plus plus where all wastewater is basically treated. So then you have a huge impact both on health and environment. So I think that's a framework that everyone's agreed on. That's an outcome that most states are now very well bought into. The technical term is fecal sludge management, which is the ODF plus. But we said, okay, let's use the narrative that the government has used already, open defecation free plus will go down really well. And we're seeing that acceptance. Some states are, of course, more progressive. Tamil Nadu had already started on the journey on fecal sludge. So we kind of use that interchangeably, but as a framework, as a collective outcome, I think ODF plus is gaining momentum. And we're seeing that both at the national level, but also with states. So the outcome for us is very clear. Reduce all of the red on the shit flow diagram and use that. And there are clear pathways to it. It's more standardized in some ways. You have to get the treatment facility in that unleashes a lot of work that has to happen in ensuring that all of the waste is collected. What are the mechanisms that we can try? And we're trying a bunch, the scheduled desludging, and then working with communities, both to ensure that they're using toilets consistently and then making sure that they understand what their containment structure should be. So it's a fairly well understood framework now, but it was easier because already the government had this big framework.
So do you, just a small question, do you see, like, I'm wondering if Dasra or Gates Foundation see a role in creating the demand for sanitation just from a high level economy, from an industry perspective, developing, parts of the sector on all the parts of the value chain that we talked about. Do you see a role in creating the demand for especially higher quality services?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So that's a huge piece of the work we do, which is why I said strategic communications is hugely important, which is to say not only holding your governments to account to provide you treatment infrastructure, but you as a community, what do you need to contribute? And as Neera said, it shouldn't be viewed as a poor person's problem, right? Not having a clean ocean front is everyone's problem. Not having clean drains in the city is everyone's problem, and all of us contribute to it, right? So we are not sure when we flush our toilets in India whether actually they're going for treatment or are they being let out into the open. So it's everyone's problem. When you're in a small city like a Narsapur or a Vai, it doesn't confine itself to low-income populations. There's no treatment for anyone. Anyone's containment system, whether you have a great septic tank, still the waste is going out into your environment. So creating that demand, both for quality services, but also for you yourself as a community to be engaged in the process, both are important.
I think the challenge with the demand side is there might be a demand for services, but I think what we need to ignite is there a willingness to pay? Right? And what is that affordable price point for which the communities we're trying to bring this to? That's where we're going to really crack it. It's kind of like in the education sector, this whole private school phenomena began to explode. Everybody wants to send their kids to English medium schools. In fact, they're paying for really shitty quality, no pun intended, English medium schools. If we can move models that are high quality, low priced, so now who's going to subsidize that innovation, right? So I think that's what I meant by the innovative financing, that we've got to figure out these price points. We've got to figure out what's affordable, where can we have the community contribute. If the cost is going to be too high, the government's sitting on fat cash, so let them come in and subsidize some of that. So I think there is a role for us to begin to break this down in a real sort of finance 101 kind of way, and think about who's going to pay what for what part of this entire, quality solution, I think is something we need to disaggregate to some extent.
But I want to add in, if you think about in sanitation, there are many cities in India that actually charge you a sewerage tax. And it's quite shocking. So if you live in Delhi and you are in an area which you're not serviced by sewerage, but you have a water connection, you're actually paying a sewerage tax. So in many cities, the poor are actually subsidizing the rich, because the richer areas of the city are actually getting sewerage. I'm living in a slum where I don't get, but I get a water connection, and I actually pay a sewerage tax. So you also have to flip it. And many poor households who have poorer containment systems actually pay much more to get their their pits and containment structures desludge more regularly. So they pay up to 1,500 rupees per excavation. Yeah? So they're actually already paying. What's not happening is it's not getting treated. So in terms of having people pay for things, they're actually paying. In some of our cities, most people are happy to pay a sanitation tax. What you need to do is to streamline that they actually get the services, and everyone gets the services, not just the people who live in the central parts of the city.
Yeah, I think it was Amartya Sen who said it's really expensive being poor. And that is a reality, especially when it comes to sanitation services. With that, I want to thank both my panelists. I hope everyone here is not just inspired, but is willing to look at the sector with a lot more urgency. And hopefully, please reach out to the people who are here. They know the sector really well. They can tell you how you can contribute to it. But this is not a problem that's going to go away, so don't assume it will. And with that, thank you very much to the both of them, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.